At the heart of character creation stands the fact that each character has a descriptor, a type, and a focus. And if you wonder what these are, you can imagine that if you have a sentence like, I'm a cruel warrior who howls at the moon, and these are actually 3 terms you find in the system book. Cruel is the descriptor, warrior is the type, and you have howls at the moon is the focus. So basically, you have to decide what kind of world do you want to have. And you have a couple of archetypes, types. You have the warrior, you have the adept, you have the explorer, you have the speaker. So these are basically the 4 basic archetypes. And of course, some of them are very easy to understand. A warrior is whoever takes up a weapon and fights. An adept is somebody who maybe consorts with the gods or consorts with the spirits or consorts with the undead, and who can cast spells or use some form of magic or channel divine energies. An explorer is somebody like your scout, like that kind of thing. And a speaker can be anything in the fantasy setting, again, like an emissary. They can be a priest, whereas the adept would be more like the cleric. But anyone, they can also be a bard, so anyone who uses social interactions to influence the game and to live in the game world. The descriptor is really a set of adjectives from which you choose, which influence the way your character is built, abilities that your character has, but also how your character is perceived by others. And of course, it informs your role playing as well, because if you are a cruel character, then you should act cruelly. And then we have the focus, and the focus is really what your character does. So if I am a cruel warrior who howls at the moon, I am essentially somebody who fights with weapons. I'm probably not the nicest person, and I also shapeshift because I howl at the moon. This is one, if you like, Cypher that stands for my deeper abilities or the type that I am. There are also, for example, those that reside in stone. Those would be your golems, if this is what your game has, or those that consort with the dead. So it could be a necromancer. It could be also somebody who maybe basically works as a medium if you're playing in a modern era. So all of these things are taken care of, and you do this by describing what the character does, what their archetype is, and how they are perceived by others. Cruel, weird, deviant. There are all kinds of explanations in the book, and they're all very well described. So that's how you do it. Now, the problem is, of course, you as the game master have to go through the book and make a decision what kind of character results you then allow. What kind of characters do you allow? Do you allow somebody to howl at the moon? Do you want somebody to be able to play a shapeshifter? Do you want somebody to have an angelic focus? These are all things that are available, but you as the game master have to make those decisions up front, then reduce the available abilities, foci, types, etc., so that your players can only choose from the ones that you deem suitable for your own world. Otherwise, it's going to explode completely. With regard to stats, you have 3: might, speed, and intellect. And you have pools of points in these. And you use those pools as kind of a health meter. So if somebody assaults you psychically by, for example, casting a spell to drive you crazy, you would lose intellect points. If somebody hits you really hard with a weapon and you take damage, you would lose might points. So that's pretty much not one area where you have life points and everything is detracted from those, but basically subtracted from those, I should say. But basically you have 3 different types of pools and you just lose points, but you can also restore them. With regard to how you run tests, you roll a d20. And each test that you have to face has a difficulty from 0, which is routine, in which you don't have to roll for it, always works, to 10, which is impossible. And then you have a target number which you have to achieve. And you get this target number by taking the difficulty level from 0 to 10 and multiplying it by 3. So 0 times 3 is 0, so you don't have to roll. But 10 times 3 is 30. Now the big question is, on a d20, how can you possibly get to 30? Because you can't. I mean, the d20 just ends at 20. However, you can use edge and effort, but also, and these are game mechanical terms, but also artifacts, for example, or even ciphers, to reduce the difficulty of a task by one or more steps. So a step, for example, if you have difficulty level 10, you would have a target number of 30. If you reduce this by one step, suddenly it's only 27, 9 times 3, and so on and so forth. Which means that you have to be aware at all times what benefits you get from your abilities and so on and so forth that you can use at any given time when you are faced with a test. Now, this is an interesting design choice, to say the least. And I was never able to understand why this was done, because you could also say we have a target number, and for my certain abilities and so on, I get a modifier which increases my d20 roll. So like you find it in Shadow Dark, like you find it as well in, for example, Fantasy Age, where you basically just add stuff to your 3d6s and so on and so forth. So this is something that you find in lots of games, but not so here. At the end of the day, taking away steps and then multiplying and then seeing what your new target number is in a way the inverse way of doing this. And again, it's a really weird design choice because it increases complexity at the table, in my opinion, because you always have to kind of go, okay, so this is now -5 plus, and then you divide, and then you multiply and blah. And it may actually be a hindrance for people. And when I was preparing this video, it suddenly struck me that the reason why this design was chosen, which is so, in my opinion, unique, I've never seen a system like it, and I've played very many different systems, including systems where you have points that you can spend that you don't recoup, like in the gumshoe system, or points that you spend and that you do get back for every single test, like DSA, the Dark Eye. And I believe it could be because Monty Cook, who had worked extensively for D&D, wanted to create a system that is so far removed from anything D&D like or reminiscent of D&D, simply to be sure that should Wizards of the Coast go off the deep end and suddenly start striking out at third-party role-playing game publishers, big ones and small ones, maybe even pulling the OGL, who would have thought that this might be a thing, he would be absolutely safe, because this system is so unlike D&D. It's so unlike any other system that I have ever played or written something for, that this could well have been a reason where he was like, you never know what's going to happen. I'm just going to build a system that is so different that no one ever can say, since I worked so closely with D&D, I basically even, in part, to a teeny tiny amount, was influenced by their IP, knowing full well, and I'm pretty sure he does, like everybody else by now should, that game mechanics themselves cannot be copyrighted. And I have to repeat this every time I make a video about this, because it's important to note, if they tell you, oh, you can't do this, you can. You cannot ever copyright a D20 or the game mechanics, like rolling against a target number, adding a modifier to your roll, and then deciding if you have met the requirements or not. So this is now why I think this design choice was made, because I have to say I like that really in the core rule books, you have everything that you need to build a world and a setting that doesn't really care about what type of game you're playing. You can play everything in there. And there is pages dedicated to fantasy, there's pages dedicated to sci-fi, there is pages dedicated to cyberpunk, to modern, to romance. It's all in there. You've got a list of monsters that you can use, and they come from all kinds of different settings, and you can just basically rebrand them. Oh, this is a lovely cyborg. I'm going to call it Golem and keep its stats, and it'll work as a fairly high-end monster in my fantasy game. It doesn't really matter because it's all just slapping on names and maybe then drawing a picture if you want to have a picture of it. And of course, there are pictures for the monsters as they are explained. And to boot all of this, we have everything also spun out in different game systems, because Cypher has produced a lot of games that have their own setting that you can buy if you don't want to do it yourself. Having said this, interestingly enough, when we sat down to create our own setting, and this was the first time I'd ever done that, really saying, okay, we're gonna build our own world, we're gonna build the characters that we provide, or the character concepts that people can have, and so on and so forth, using Cypher, it was really simple. It took a long while because we had to go through everything that was there. We had to sit down first and say, okay, so what kind of a world are we imagining? What kind of backgrounds should people be able to have? What kind of archetypes should they be able to play? And then we were able to just spin them out using the core rulebook. So if this is your thing, and this is what my recommendation is, Cypher is highly versatile. Cypher is innovative. Cypher is difficult for the GM. You have to put in a lot of prep work to design your campaign using the information around characters that are available or will be available to your players. Once you have done this, and once people have come to grips with how edge works, how effort works, which I still think is, in my opinion, way too complex, although I like doing math and I'm really good at doing this in my head, I found it got in the way. So we actually left a lot of this to the side. So we basically didn't really go into that much detail. Okay, well, I've got this, so this gives me edge, and then I can do this, blah, blah, blah. So you at the table then have to decide how complex you want this to be. You can always go and homebrew some of the stuff, but then you can also turn it into a completely narrative game where you just really roll in very particular situations. Because there is another thing that you can do, or that exists, and that is the so-called GM intrusion. And that's basically when the GM plays fate. Unfortunately, the examples for GM intrusions in the book are really bad, which is why I'm not going to quote them, because they actually give a wrong impression, in my opinion, of what GM intrusions are and how they should be used. GM intrusions are, and some of them are also baked into the character concept. So, for example, if you are somebody who deals with weapons, one of the GM intrusions could be your weapon breaks. So what happens is the GM throws something really terrible at you, and it can be life deciding. If push came to shove, they really face you with a situation that's dire. But as a result, you get experience. Usually you get 2 experience points, one you keep for yourself and one you give to another player character. You can also help people and say, okay, you really want to try this. You don't have the wherewithal to do this, but I can play fate for you. I offer you a GM intrusion. So it's going to make it terrible for you in some way, but the problem at hand will be solved and you get XP. But you will suffer the consequences some other time. And that's the mechanics behind this. So it is when the GM actually actively takes part on a meta level in the game. Now, again, this is an interesting design choice, which I've never seen implemented like this anywhere else, where the, if you like, the GM leaves the story that is being told and takes on the mantle of almost like a godlike figure. Oh, you know, I'm gonna intervene here, but you're gonna get experience, or you can choose to get intervention. Now, I believe that I don't know Monty Cook, but I think he's probably a very cerebral person, and he has written mechanics without necessarily thinking that an inexperienced GM will look at this and kind of go, what? But of course, if you have ever run games, you can, of course, do the GM intrusion differently. I have watched a playthrough, I've watched a real play of the Cypher system for extended periods of time. And the DM chose to actually say, I'll offer you a GM intrusion. She actually went to the length of specifying this is what I'm going to do. So she invoked the mechanics and it worked. But of course, you can also, depending on the character that you're interacting with, clothe this into something else. So for example, if you are playing, if the player character you are interacting with and that you want a GM intrusion to happen to, and they are, let's say, a cleric, then you can clothe this into the deity interacting with them. The deity raising a finger saying, hey, you know, if it's a weapons master, it could be the weapon. It could be the armor. It could be something like that. It could be a sudden influx of enemies, which constitutes the GM intrusion without actually calling it that. Both are possible. And I think that it might have helped the rules if the description of how GM intrusions works would have been a little less cerebral all the time, because it defaults back to the mechanics rather than how you could blend them into the game naturally. But I think this is just a question of how experienced the GM is, and also how you want to run the game, but both are possible. So to me, the Cypher system is a very interesting system, and I think a lot of people will have a lot of fun with it. It is definitely something you can use for any fantasy setting that you want. High fantasy, low fantasy, it doesn't matter. You can also bring in a little bit of gunpowder if you wish. But I will say it's for experienced groups and also an extremely experienced GM who doesn't mind putting in the time to prep it. But it is one that works for long-term storytelling. It works for campaigns because there is character progression, which is actually quite meaningful. And if you want to know how to create a character, I did actually do a conversion of a Midgard character into the Cypher system because I wanted to see if it was really true that you could take any character concept from anywhere and put it into this system, and it works. So you can check my channel for Cypher related content. I also did an in-depth review of the actual and a leaf through of the actual book, so that you can also look at this. It is beautifully made, in my opinion. It is difficult to read. The index sucks. This is something that I really have to say. It is really difficult to find stuff. But it could be that they have maybe done a different edition by now where you can actually find stuff more easily. I suggest that if you want to run this, you get the PDF as well so that you can look up stuff really quickly at the table. So that's Cypher System by Monty Cook. Another alternative to whichever system you're playing for your fantasy RPG at the moment. Talk to you soon. Bye.